back to the Daily Grind. Thanks for checking out the channel. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back pickle biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
Hashtag and still. That's how I'm gonna start this video off. UFC 220 predictions in Boston. Hey, I had fun doing these predictions. This card is actually better than I thought when I looked at it. When I just looked at this card on surface value, of course everybody wants to see the main event and the co-main event, but also I wanted to see Thomas Almeida versus Rob Font. I didn't know too much about the rest of these guys on the card, but after doing research for these predictions, actually Shane Burgos versus Calvin Kattar is going to be a great fight as well. I don't know who's going to win that fight. I started off leaning toward Kattar, ended up switching to Burgos. I think, hey, all right, we're going to get into these predictions starting with the first fight of the night. Now, if you go to UFC.com, it doesn't have the official like 5 main card announced as far as the 5 fights that are going to be on, so that means you guys get an extra prediction. Normally, I just do the main card, but Bochniak versus Davis might not be on the main card, but either way, we're going to do the prediction. Or they might make Thomas Almeida Rob Font the main event of the prelims and put Bochniak Davis on. So either way, we're predicting 6 of these fights. 5 of them are likely to be on UFC 220's pay-per-view main card. So these are the UFC 220 main card predictions. Let's start with the first fight of the night, which is between Kyle Bochniak, who's 7-2, and Brandon Davis, who is 8-2 in their professional mixed martial arts career. Kyle Bochniak is 1-2 in the UFC. He's coming off of a loss to Jeremy Kennedy, who took him down 8 times in the fight. Brandon Davis is 1-0 in the UFC, and he's coming off of a win in his UFC debut over Austin Arnett, where he was outstruck in the fight metrics, but he won a unanimous decision. So that could have mean he finished the round stronger. You know, he might have, almost knocked the guy out or almost finished the fight, or just landed more significant strikes. But he won a unanimous decision in his UFC debut. I want to be going with Brandon Davis to win this fight, because Kyle Bochniak's only win in his 3 UFC fights was a split decision in which he was outstruck on the UFC.com fight metrics. So I'm just going with Brandon Davis to win this fight. Not too much to be said on this fight. Don't know much about these guys. I probably watched the UFC fights, but they don't stand out on the top of my head. So I'm picking Brandon Davis to win this fight. Now, moving to Thomas Almeida versus Rob Font, a fight that I'm super excited for. When I just saw that on paper, I was like, that's just a dope fight. Thomas Almeida is the ranked number 10 bantamweight in the world. He's 22-2 in his professional career, 5-2 in the UFC. He's going to be fighting the number 14th ranked bantamweight in the world, Rob Font, who's 14-3 and 4-2 in the UFC. So these guys both have similar records in the UFC. One of them's 5-2, one's 4-2. But I'm going to be picking Thomas Almeida to win this fight. Thomas Almeida's only professional losses in his career, he's 22-2. His only 2 losses are to Cody Garbrandt, the former UFC champion, and Jimmy Rivera, who's one of the bantamweight dark horses, you know, one of the best bantamweights in the world, who's looking for bantamweight gold. So Thomas Almeida's only losses are to some of the best guys in the world, and he's also beat some of the better bantamweights in his career. Thomas Almeida is 4 out of his 5 UFC wins were all KO TKOs. So Thomas Almeida's coming in there to do damage and finish guys. But the same thing can be said for Rob Font, who's 4-2 in the UFC, and all 4 of Rob Font's wins are finishes. Now he's coming off of a first round submission loss to Pedro Munoz, and I'm going to be picking Thomas Almeida to win this fight because he's more experienced and he's fought tougher competition in his professional career. He's beat and lost to tougher guys. As I said, he lost to Cody Garbrandt and Jimmy Rivera. Rob Font lost to Pedro Munoz and somebody else. So I'm picking Thomas Almeida to get this W. Moving on to Gian Villante versus Francimar Barroso. I don't know why that name sounds, it's just so fun to say, and I don't even know, Barroso. That's just, hey, Barroso. I gotta, you know what I'm saying? That's just fucking dope. Let's go. So let's get into this fight. Gian Villante is 15-8. 5-6 in the UFC. He has lost more fights in the UFC than he has won. I believe he trains with Matt Serra, you know, and Ray Longo and like Aljamain Sterling and Chris Weidman and those guys. Gian Villante is coming off of a 2-fight losing streak. He was TKO'd by Shogun Rua. Then he lost a split decision to Patrick Cummings. Gian Villante's most recent win was Fight of the Night in December of 2016 when he won via KO TKO over Saparek Safarov. Now, Francimar Barroso is 19-5. 4-3 in the UFC, so his record is a little bit better, and he's 1-1 in his last 2 fights. His losses in the UFC are to some seriously tough but relatively unknown dudes. You probably wouldn't know who Alexander Rakic or you probably do know Nikita Krylov, but those are 2 of the guys, Francimar Barroso. I'm just going to call him Barroso because Francimar's hard, you know, Barroso. Alright, you probably wouldn't know who Alexander Rakic and Nikita Krylov are, but if you actually look at who they are in the UFC, they're actually some really talented guys who are arguably in their prime, and that's who Barroso has lost to recently. So I'm going with Barroso, who is the less known fighter in this fight. A lot of people, you know, Gian Villante, the heartthrob, he's one of the fan favorites. He's been on the MMA Hour and stuff like that. So I'm going with Barroso to win this fight. For one, because I love saying his name, and also because he's got a very strong wrestling. He's been fighting killers arguably in their prime, and his strong wrestling. If you look at his fights, he's taken down like a lot of his UFC fights. He scored multiple takedowns, and Gian Villante, I think, might be a little susceptible to takedowns when you're talking about someone on Barroso's level. So he's also another argument for Barroso is he's been fighting killers in the UFC, and although they're relatively unknown, they're in their prime. He's been fighting prime up-and-coming killers. Gian Villante's been fighting like Shogun Rua and Patrick Cummins, who are arguably outside of their prime. So I'm going with Barroso, and he might be an upset here. I'm not sure. The odds aren't out for these yet, so I'm going with Barroso to get the win here. Now, next fight. This is a fight I'm actually really excited for. After I did the research, I watched Calvin Kattar's UFC debut as well as Shane Burgos' last 2 UFC fights in order to make this prediction. Calvin Kattar had a very successful UFC debut on short notice versus Andre Fili, but whenever a fighter takes a fight on short notice and he's making his UFC debut, Andre Fili is really just taking a fight against a guy that really nobody... He can't prepare for the guy on short notice. For one, it's not like he knew about it's not like he knew about Calvin Kattar before his UFC debut, and so Andre Fili lost that fight. And Andre Fili is a very talented fighter. That's why originally I was leaning toward picking Kattar, because I forgot about who Shane Burgos was. After I watched his last 2 fights, I definitely remembered him. But Calvin Kattar's nickname is also the Boston Finisher. This is UFC 220 in Boston, so I was like, oh shit, 17-2 Boston Finisher versus undefeated Shane Burgos. Calvin Kattar looked very impressive versus Andre Fili, Team Alpha Male. So that's an impressive win. So I originally thought I was going to be picking Kattar in this fight, but if you look at Kattar's other fights, I mean, I'll get into it after I talk about Shane Burgos for a second. Shane Burgos is undefeated, 10-0, 3-0 in the UFC. Shane Burgos was very active in the UFC as an undefeated fighter. He made his UFC debut at 7-0 in December of 2016 and won that fight to move to 8-0. Then he fought again in April and again in July of 2017 and moved to 10-0 quickly in the UFC. And he's got wins over Charles Rosa and Godfredo Pepe. Now, Kattar had in his fight that I watched, Kattar had a little bit of trouble with Andre Fili's southpaw stance when he would switch to it, and Andre Fili did a good job of attacking Kattar's legs, which is going to be a good strategy versus Shane Burgos, because if you listen to Dominic Cruz's commentary in Shane Burgos' fight versus Charles Rosa, he was saying like Shane Burgos, you know, he puts a lot of power on his lead leg because he's a power puncher. He likes throwing heavy shots. So Calvin Kattar is going to really have to try and attack that leg, but even with Charles Rosa attacking his leg in that fight, he was still knocked out in the 3rd round. So Burgos is just a very exciting prospect coming up, undefeated, man. And as I said, he's going to be, this is how I see the fight going. Shane Burgos is going to be walking forward, throwing power shots, and Calvin Kattar is going to be trying to pick him apart. Now, the thing about Calvin Kattar is his competition before his UFC debut was a little suspect, as he's 17-2, but most of those wins, I'll say 14 of those wins, came before the year 2014 in an organization that I've never heard of. So he does have like 2 wins that outside of the UFC. After that, still, it wasn't in like Bellator or LFA or anything like that. But the thing that really had me, you know, a little bit believing in Calvin Kattar was his performance versus Andre Fili. But then I find out Shane Burgos trains with Jimmy Rivera, you know, out at Tiger Schultz, I believe. So Shane Burgos, man, I just think he might be a little too much for Calvin Kattar in this fight. Even though Calvin Kattar is the Boston finisher, one interesting fact is he's actually has more decisions than finishes in his 17 wins. And as I said, a lot of those wins come before the year 2014 in an organization we didn't really heard of. He took a break and now he's back and he's looking good. But now that he's back to MMA, he looked really good versus Andre Fili. But I'm picking Shane Burgos. And Shane Burgos is from New York. Calvin Kattar's from Boston. This is New York versus Boston. I think Shane Burgos is going to come in here and get the upset, man, on Calvin Kattar's hometown soil. Now, not even I put a lot more effort into the Calvin Kattar and these other picks than the main event and the co-main event, because as I said earlier, hashtag and still Volkan Ozdemir, I hear you and all, he's a knockout artist and all, and I know Daniel Cormier just got knocked out and all, but Daniel Cormier is one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time. Volkan Ozdemir has knocked out Jimi Manuwa, Misha Serkinov, split decision versus OSP, looked very impressive in his UFC stint thus far, but now he's facing the greatest. He's not facing some and Jimi Manuwa, the impressive performance. I'm saying Daniel Cormier's wrestling is on a whole nother level. I'm predicting the champ to come in here and get the job done. Volkan Ozdemir, we know he's got some legal issues going on. I don't think that's going to affect his fight at all, affect his mind. Daniel Cormier, though, the champ, coming back from his knockout loss at UFC 214 to John Jones. John Jones was stripped of the title, Daniel Cormier was reinstated, and now Daniel Cormier I'm picking to come in here and defend his crown. Now, Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou. This one is a little more probably surprising to a lot of people. All you hear is Francis Ngannou is going to fucking blow Stipe back. All you hear is Stipe Miocic is going to get knocked out in the first round. All you hear is Francis Ngannou is too big for Stipe Miocic. All you hear is Francis Ngannou has been at the Performance Institute getting fucking Bane juice pumped into him, according to Brendan Schaub. You know, he had some pretty funny jokes on his podcast. You know, he said, like, Francis Ngannou was like Bane. They got him in the Performance Institute, giving him everything he needs to eat, the perfect training for free. Just get, you know what I'm saying? And you make good points. But Stipe Miocic is arguably the greatest heavyweight champion of all time. And if he beats Francis Ngannou, I believe he will break the record of 3 title defenses at heavyweight, which breaks the heavyweight defense record. So Stipe Miocic, and you know, Francis Ngannou has some very impressive knockouts over Alistair Overeem, Andrei Arlovski, and such. But Stipe Miocic has knocked out the same guys as Francis Ngannou, essentially. Stipe Miocic has definitely fought tougher competition, and when he fought Arlovski, he was more prime, you could say, than when Ngannou fought Arlovski, because, you know what I'm saying, it's just facts. Francis Ngannou was the most recent to fight Alistair Overeem, so he's taking the most damage. So Stipe Miocic, man, he does have his hands full, but it is what it is, man. This is the champion for a reason. And now this is coming from a guy that picked Alistair Overeem to beat Francis Ngannou, and that clearly didn't happen. The motherfucking uppercut from Cameroon came through. Whoopsie! So I'm picking Stipe Miocic. Am I fucking 100% confident? Fuck no. But I am picking Stipe Miocic to defend his belt. Hashtag and still. I'm picking both champions to get the job done. The rest of the card is going to be fun, but keep in mind Bellator 192 is on the same night of this card for free. Chael Sonnen versus Rampage Jackson, Roy McDonald versus Douglas Lima, Michael Chandler versus Gordy Yamauchi, Aaron Pico's coming through on the card, man. I gotta have both of those fights up. I can't choose. I literally can't choose between these two cards. I have to have 2 screens up, 2 TVs, and I have to watch them both. That's how I've got to do this. Both of these cards are amazing, and they both are on January 20th. So with that being said, it is what it is. Let the full-time family know who you think's gonna win in the comments. I'm out.
Da 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 da! It's the motherfucking DOWG!